now, we are very honored to have our keynote speaker here with us today and to introduce her and have a conversation with her about her career, borders, and some insight as to where she sees the future for how the geopolitical scene is going to be looking in the short and long term. It is a pleasure for me to ask our president, Dr. Marie Price, to join us. Marie?
Good afternoon, everyone. So today's keynote speaker is a remarkable champion of human rights. Ambassador Samantha Power served on the National Security Council during the Obama administration. Then in the second term, she was appointed the 28th U.S. Ambassador to the United States. She's currently a professor at Harvard University with appointments in the Law School and the Kennedy School. It's worth noting for you students out there that after she graduated as an undergraduate from Yale, she spent time in Bosnia reporting on the war there in the 1990s. That experience and a paper she wrote while in Harvard Law School eventually led to a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. Ambassador Power wears many hats as a journalist, activist, scholar, diplomat, educator, author, athlete, immigrant, mother, partner, problem solver, and self-described idealist. This year, she published her memoir, The Education of an Idealist, which I'm holding in my hand. And this beautifully written book lays out a life of activism, striving, humor, service, and struggle. It is delivered with deliberate self-reflection, depth, and authenticity. The American Geographical Society is so pleased to welcome Ambassador Samantha Power to Geography 2050, Borders in the Borderless World. Thank you. So the format of today is I have several questions that I have prepared based on the book and tied to the themes of today. So let's dive right in. The first one is that you are Irish-born, an immigrant, and spent the first 9 years of your life in Dublin. In reading your book, I had to wonder what influence growing up with the Troubles in Northern Ireland had on leading to your life's work addressing human rights.
Thank you so much, Dr. Price. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Can I say a quick word about geography? Because when else am I ever going to get to say a quick word about geography? I was yesterday in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I ultimately went to high school. And I did an event at the Carter Center, wonderful sold-out event, great crowd, great energy. And who should walk up in my book signing line but my geography teacher, who is the best teacher I ever had. I went to public high school, Lakeside High School in Atlanta, Georgia, and there he was. Wow, who knew? But Mr. Driscoll, there he was, and the impact, especially the, I guess, 50 or 60 of you who are high school teachers that you can have. Mr. Driscoll would not have guessed that I, a kind of okay student, but not superstar student, would ever go on into working in diplomacy, but he laid a lot of really important seeds. And then the other thing I want to say is my daughter is here, who's 7, and even though I look like I'm not the mother of the year because she's on my phone, what she's doing on my phone is she's playing an app called Stack the States, which I really recommend to the parents of young children. She has one for Europe and one for the United States, and she's getting better and better at figuring out where all the states go, how they fit together, what their state flags are, who they border, et cetera. And then the other thing, just in light of your question, I just mentioned my father's here, who is the person who brought my mother and my younger brother and myself to America. And so I'm lucky to have both generations of my family with me here today. To your question, so I came to America when I was 9 with Eddie, my mother, and my younger brother from Ireland. And, to be honest, even though it is factually the case that growing up in Dublin, there were terrorist attacks, for example, the year of my brother's birth, 1974, right in downtown Dublin, very near where my mother was working, and very near where my father went to the pub every day. There were thousands of refugees coming, in fact, from Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland, and especially into Dublin. But it didn't register in the sense of feeling a threat. I think the stamps that it left were twofold. One, always, never really with a sense that conflict was something that happened to those people. Do you know what I mean? There's a way in which sometimes we Americans, in our relatively splendid isolation until 2001, had a sense of kind of conflict and tragedy there. I think just a sense that it can happen to anyone, that you can have, you know, the same educational levels as and be felled by the virus of nationalism or xenophobia or sectarianism. I mean, I would have carried that sense with me. And then the other issue, which I really got from my dad, but you know, the Irish Republican traditions, the fight songs, the poems, the, you know, speeches at the gallows when Irish rebels were being put to death. I mean, those things were all rooted in a conception of dignity that I think I've carried with me. The notion that occupation is a violation of dignity, or that people from the outside can come in and just not know the essence of a culture. And that's a good check, I think, on some of the hubris, especially if you're promoting human rights, or if you work for the US government, you work for the superpower. It's good to remember, again, the central importance of dignity, and that ends up being a real through line, I think, in my life, is just appreciating individual dignity. When I became UN ambassador, as you know from having read the book, I went around and I met with each of the other 191 UN ambassadors, which should not have been a big deal, partly so I could make sure my geography was good on countries in Africa, for example, that I hadn't visited, and I wasn't so good at necessarily on exactly where the capital was relative to somebody else's country. But I went around and I met with them, and about 50 of them, more than 50, had never been visited by a US ambassador to the UN in the history of the UN. And for me, it was so important to show respect, to see the dignity of these individuals and the dignity of these nations, and not sit back just because the United States is powerful and expect other countries to come to us. And I know I heard the other panel, one of the references was made to LGBT rights and the effort we made at the Human Rights Council to get the Special Rapporteur for LGBT rights position created. I trace our ability to do that to the number one, where Latin America has come on LGBT rights. That was a huge factor because they were our partners in the effort. But number two, to those courtesy calls, showing respect, making people feel like you see them, like making people feel that you see their countries, their music, their art. You ask those questions, and then when you turn around and ask ambassadors to take a really hard vote, and an LGBT rights vote is a really hard vote even now for a lot of countries, or if you ask them to pretend they have a dental appointment during the vote, you're much more likely to get lucky if you've invested and shown that America cares.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears, and 100 years ago, the American Geographical Society led the inquiry with President Wilson. And this we led the US delegation in peace negotiations in Paris after World War I. And at the time, the belief was that getting borders right was the best path to peace. World War II disabused us of the faith of lines in the map. And from your perspective, a century later, how important are borders in addressing ethno-territorial or sectarian conflicts? And do diplomats in the 21st century see altering borders part of their diplomatic toolbox?
Let me start with your last question. That's a hefty, there'd be a course on that entire set of questions, but I do not think, unless I'm missing something, that diplomats think of altering borders as part of this otherwise broad toolbox, a toolbox that might include, in the face of a crisis, diplomatic condemnation, or targeted economic sanctions, or arms embargoes, or peacekeepers, or conflict mediation team. And there's 1,000 tools in the toolbox. Altering borders, I don't think I know too many diplomats who think early as you're grappling with a crisis about altering borders, and that may be a flaw in the profession, but I think by and large, if there's a lesson that has been taken, it has been just that, number one, we all know that borders have been drawn, of course, in the wrong place so many times, and that has sown the seeds for future conflict. But when I think of borders, and as you mentioned in your introduction, I cut my teeth as a young person in my early 20s in the Balkans, but I remember there was a Macedonian satirist who said that the sort of driving mantra of the Balkan Wars was, why should I be a minority in your state when you can be a minority in mine? Which is really, it was a satirist who said there's a profundity to that. Is like, you could be a Serb and be a majority in Yugoslavia, then when Yugoslavia broke up, suddenly you found yourself not a majority in Bosnia, therefore you fought in order to carve out a greater Serbia and have part of Bosnia be part of Serbia effectively. And so I think at this point, the approach that Ireland has so benefited from, and that is in grave peril, or has been in grave peril because of Brexit, is more the approach that people have gravitated toward, and that is the idea of rendering borders less meaningful through trading agreement, through customs unions, through people's movements. But of course, now we're living, as one of the speakers talked about earlier, we're living in the period where there's a populist backlash against that sense of borderlessness. But as some of the economic data shows, integration, rather than, again, going into a negotiation thinking, okay, how do we adjust something here that's, even if it was wrong to begin with, has created a set of expectations, isn't it better to think regionally? And the last thing I'll say on this is, and I know we have people from the State Department and other government agencies here, it's notoriously true that the US government, even the UN, the UN is getting a bit better at it, but we tend to be very bounded by borders in the way we do our diplomacy. So, in fact, I can say, I'm not a big fan of the current administration, but I can say one nice thing about the administration, or one, not even necessarily a nice thing, I won't go too far, but what I can say is that their ambassadors don't respect borders at all. Like Sondland was in Ukraine. Like, the notion that our ambassador to the EU would have been in Ukraine, which isn't in the EU, or even at one point their ambassador to Germany was in Ukraine. I actually think we could use more of that. Not what they were doing on their trips, needless to say, but the strictures in which diplomats, not just from the United States, but from many countries around the world, feel bound by, are very old school, very geographic. So even though we've evolved, the threats have certainly evolved, right, to be crossing borders, cyber, ISIS, climate, you name it, drugs, criminals, they're crossing borders, and yet the way we practice our diplomacy is quite siloed and quite, it would be anathema for the ambassador to Germany to travel, to France and do official business, and yet I think more of those collaborations and conversations need to be happening. And so we need to broaden, I think, the border-based perspectives of the people doing the work of diplomacy today.
So you have been very passionate about the plight of immigrants and refugees in particular. And when I was reading your book, I read a quote that stopped me cold, and it was from a refugee woman, and she told you, "People are dying every day for the chance to brush their teeth in the morning and go to school." So there are so many basic human needs that are not met, and the intractability of our refugee issues seems to be worsening. Do you see any hopeful signs with regards to addressing these crises?
Well, let me first say a word about that lovely young woman. She has subsequently actually gotten a little bit famous in the small world that I inhabit, I suppose, but she's actually a wheelchair-bound Syrian who, with her older sister, some of you may have seen there's like short clips of her being interviewed and so forth, but with her older sister as a young teenager, basically fled in her wheelchair and made it all the way to Germany from Syria, effectively, kind of rolling herself the entire way, or occasionally being pushed by her sister. I mean, she is she's a Syrian Kurd, and I met her in Berlin, and so what she was talking about, the dying she was talking about, was people entrusting their fates to smugglers to just make it over the sea in order to, then be able to get on a land route to find some opportunity, some safety, some more permanent safety. And so that's what she was talking about, is because, people were asking, why are all these parents risking the lives of their children? Answer, they don't want to leave, that's for sure. That's why they remained in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan for so long. They wanted desperately to go back. But at a certain point, when there's no school and the rations have run out and you have no more savings, you're looking for some way of being able to reliably know you're going to be able to just get up and brush your teeth. And so she was an immensely powerful figure and testified, in fact, before the Security Council not that long ago, sometime in the last year. Of all the areas that have not, where we've been, I think, regressing, refugees and immigration, I think, is the hardest place to find sources of hope. And I'll just, because what I have to say is not so upbeat on that, I'll just say a word on something that I came across, for example, that is a source for hope in a very different domain that you didn't ask about, but that I think would matter to this audience, which is climate change and climate science. I think with refugees and immigrants, about the darkest topic one can think about these days. But there's just a new study in Nature that shows that even though there's a completely partisan split on what to do about on climate science and climate denial, and then what to do about climate change, turns out Republicans and Democrats are using solar power and acquiring solar power at exactly the same rates in this country. And so actually the move toward renewables may well outpace the political debate, or is at present. So that's the good news, because I don't have great news on refugees. And that's not that great of news on climate compared to where we need to be. But on refugees, I'd say, and immigrants, first, just to pause this week to celebrate the profile of several immigrants who've made it into the news for reasons that they never would have wished to make it into the news. Lieutenant Colonel Vidman, Ambassador Masha Jovanovic, and Fiona Hill, a great Russia specialist. I mean, it's just incredible to peel back the curtain on the work that so many people here also are doing, and just see the expertise, the authenticity, the professionalism, the rigor, so much to say. Whatever about the content, just you got a window, not only, as everybody's been saying, into diplomacy and into the Foreign Service and into the civil service in the US government, and frankly, a mirror into how that happens in other Western governments and other democracies as well. But you've now also additionally gotten the collateral benefit, I think, of just getting one lens into what immigrants have offered our country and the amount, the extent to which they are doing public service. And so I think that's a bright spot, is just that lens was provided. I wish that there was more of a bipartisan embrace of that right now. I still think in the heads of many Republican senators who've thrown their weight behind a much more exclusionary, I think, kind of much less diverse, much less inclusive conception of America, I still think that pride exists in what America is, and so it just has to be tapped. It's not going to be tapped soon, at least by the current leadership, but I think it still does exist. I mean, remember, very prominent Republicans themselves are immigrants or descendants of immigrants, and so there's, I think, an imaginable path to recovering that kind of bipartisan support for these kinds of issues, and so that's something. And then the flip of the partisanship, I guess you could say, offers some solace, which is, it used to be, I'll talk specifically about refugees. It has always been the case, whether we're talking about the Second World War and the resistance to Jews coming to this country, or the late 70s, early 80s, Cambodian, Vietnamese boat people, or even back in the 50s when Hungarians were fleeing the Soviet crackdown, it's always been the case that the question of whether to welcome refugees has been contested. And so it's not as if there's been this sort of halcyon time where it had 80% approval ratings. It's often been a majority, which is good, the welcome, but sometimes a very slim majority, and often a plurality where some number of people are kind of neutral on the question. And so what's different about today is that the issue of whether to welcome, it's not that it is unpopular in some quarters, it's that in the past, the unpopularity has been bipartisan and the popularity has been bipartisan. So what's different is that the question of whether to welcome refugees is now so partisan. And so why could that be an answer to, is there a hopeful sign? Well, because in the Democratic Party, as it turns out, the support for welcoming refugees, partly out of an organic sort of view of what being in the Democratic Party means, so partly out of loyalty to larger principles, but partly also as a reaction to how partisan the issue has become. The popularity is greater than it has ever been. It's up now 90%, and including very high numbers on welcome Syrian refugees. Those numbers were not nearly as high among Democrats under President, when we were trying to get Syrian refugees into the country. So in that sense, in it becoming partisan, which I think is generally a bad thing, it at least has had the effect of causing, Democrats who've been on the fence about this issue to think more seriously about how opening our arms, strengthens our country, how much it is a part really of the country we have been and wish to be.
You coined a term called upstander, and that's someone who speaks up and does something as opposed the opposite of a bystander. So the world is filled with challenges, we call even broken places. So how do you pick your battles now?
Well, one of the things I write about in the book, but I now have a new wrinkle on because of having traveled around, talked a little bit about the content of the book, is that I had the experience when I was UN ambassador of getting an email from a Wall Street Journal reporter who informed me that the Oxford English Dictionary was adding this word, upstander, to the dictionary, and that in the Oxford English Dictionary, I was going to be credited with having invented the word and having written a book about the man who invented the word genocide, that included discussion of the man who invented the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin. This was like the coolest thing ever. And, but not long ago, when I was speaking at Keene University, I met two teachers, again, shout out to the high school teachers here, and they had assigned a portion of my book, or a portion of a speech or something I'd given, I can't remember. And their students, high school students, said this word is a really important word, upstander, because it defines, we as young people are much more likely to find ourselves as bystanders or upstanders than, hopefully, as perpetrators, and hopefully, although some different people would have different views on this, as victims of gross injustice of the kind that they were reading about. And so there's this word matters. And so these teachers told me that it was these high school students who wrote to the Oxford English Dictionary. They wrote to every dictionary, and they plied them with like petitions basically to add this word. And so I just thought it was the most, again, for people who teach, whether I teach at the university and graduate school level, or you who teach in high school, like what an amazing what amazing teachers, right, to sort of inculcate, and what amazing parents to inculcate that spirit in the students, but also just the determination. So it did not happen by accident. It was because these little upstanders wanted this word to exist so they'd have some source of identification. What was the question again? I digressed. What was the question?
How do you pick your battles now?
How do you pick your battles? I think in general, I go to, kind of what's really bad, where you feel that there's a pathway. And, I wrote the book. I know a lot of us spend a lot of time these days feeling small next to the scale of the kinds of problems we've discussed: climate change, refugee displacement, let's say racial injustice in this country, inequality especially. It's just very easy you have the thought of, I want to do something, and then it so quickly can get swallowed up by, but what can one person do? And so the concept that I have latched onto in my work life and that I write about in the book is borrowed from Chip and Dan Heath. Some of you have read the book Switch, Making Change When Change is Hard, I think is the subtitle or something like that. And they introduced this concept, which is shrink the change. So they basically argue, you know, when you see a big problem, the temptation is to think that you need a big solution. As soon as you think you need a big solution, you kind of by definition know that you single-handedly can't solve climate change or inequality, and so you might be tempted to not do anything at all because you feel, again, sort of infinitesimal compared to the scale of the challenge. And so the idea of shrink the change is figure out your tiny slice. And the example I offer in the book, and this is kind of how I pick my battles, I suppose, is whether you can define something in this manner. But as I said, I was working as U.S. Ambassador to the UN. We were in our, at that time it was, I think, the 10th year of human rights in decline around the world. So this decline definitely predated Donald Trump, for sure. We're now in the 13th year of freedom in decline around the world. And you know, even though I was a member of the cabinet of the President of the United States, I felt small. And so I said to my team, one of whom was here earlier this morning, the great Kelly Razouk, who's now with the International Rescue Committee, you know, what can we do? The problems are big, and even though we're in the US government at a high level, like we're small, so what are we gonna do? And so we came up with this idea, which was to launch a campaign to try to secure the release of 20 female political prisoners around the world. And we call the campaign #FreeThe20. And for those of you who have the book or getting the book, there's a photo of the campaign in the insets of the book. And it was just women from China who were protesting sexual harassment, Ethiopia, who were political protesters, wanted more civic space, Egypt, you know, countries with which the US was aligned, as well as Syria, Venezuela, countries that there's a tradition of kind of having adversarial ties. And it was really hard to get our ambassadors in the countries with which we had strong ties or important ties to sign off on celebrating these women who were behind bars and trying to secure their release. But we managed. And we used social media, and we my team dug into the details on each of these women so that the story we told was textured and not kind of cliched or silhouette, but really where you felt like you knew the woman and what she had risked in order to try to improve her community. And we got, in a rare bipartisan act, the 20 female US senators in the US Senate, happened to be 20, coinciding with our campaign, it was a coincidence. But they threw their weight, Republican, Democrat alike, behind the campaign. And in conjunction with the lawyers and the family members of these women who'd been lobbying for months, in some cases years, to secure the release of these women, we were able to get 16 of the 20 women out of jail. And this is, it's so sweet, but it's so small. It's so small. And yet, it is small for each of these women. It is the universe, of course, and for their families, but also for those civil servants and foreign servants that I got to work with every day, to see the kind of strut in their steps, the belief that if you know, in a very tailored way, you know, went about trying to bite off a tiny slice of the larger problem, the way you could make a difference. So that's something I really recommend in terms of prioritization, is shrinking the change in some fashion, hoping, again, over time, that you aggregate in a manner that creates a cascade, a virtuous cascade instead of the other kind, which we've had lately.
So in the audience are AP Human Geography teachers, professors. We have a lot of educators, and we care deeply about geography. That's our passion, and maybe we believe educating people in geography is trying to shrink the problem and be upstanders rather than bystanders. What advice would you give? You teach, you've also taught a course in geopolitics. How do you make geography interesting to people, and why does it matter in the work of an ambassador in human rights?
Well, let me, I know we don't have a lot of time, I'll just come at the question in two different directions. So for starters, I was a little bit Rip Van Winkle on, let me call it geopolitics rather than geography, which of course has a nexus with geography, but I thought less about that field specifically. But so I was a Rip Van Winkle insofar as I left teaching for 10 years and then came back to a classroom after, an inspiring decade where Barack Obama was president and many important things happened around the world, but also where some of the trends that we've been discussing, laid bare the human costs already and the horrible trajectories that some of them are on. And so I went back to the classroom and I went to the Kennedy School, and I teach at Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard Law School, and I said, so I used to teach US foreign policy and human rights. Now I've actually been the president's human rights advisor and the UN ambassador who pushed a human rights agenda. My course is going to be awesome. And, I'm going to teach my course. I'm going to obviously revamp everything, but I've been doing this now. I've been a practitioner for 10 years in different, in Obama's Senate office, then on the campaign, then in the White House, and then at the UN. And the response was, nah, no, U.S. foreign policy and human rights, nah, not so much. We're not so interested. And I go, but what? What do you mean? I have so much, I have so much. Anyway, the point was my class now is called Geopolitics, Human Rights, and the Future of Statecraft. And I'm happy to share a syllabus with anybody who wants one. Just email me. But what I ended up realizing was, or what they were, quick to drive home to my U.S.-centered small brain was, the world has changed, right? Like the Kennedy School, who's in our class has changed, in the sense that it's more international. It was always very international. But if you want to understand the way the world is moving, you have to come at, and what will impact human rights, or what will impact the Ebola response, or the refugee response, or climate, or terrorism, or any of the big geopolitical issues, or even the Sustainable Development Goals, which many of you are interested in, you're going to have to look not only at the US as a player, but of course at the other major heavyweight in the room, China. You're going to have to look at the EU and how its inward focus is altered, what it does beyond its borders. And above all, I now have a unit that's as long as my China unit on Facebook as a player. And if I had slides here, I would show you. I show my students a slide, and it's got all the flags of the UN, 193 countries in the UN, and wedged between, and it's just a list of the flags in order according to GDP. And after 167 of the countries, I think it's Switzerland is 167 is basically richer than 167 of the countries. So in order of wealth, getting wealthier, you have Switzerland. Then the 168th, again, wealthiest is Sweden. And guess whose GDP, the equivalent of whose GDP is right between the two of them? Facebook. More adherents than Christianity at this point. So I can't talk about human rights or humanitarian effects without really sort of upending the traditional models and the kind of bordered conception of what geopolitics is. So that's one thing I'd say. And then much more briefly, the last thing I'll say is, because it was really your question, was about how to make it accessible. I already mentioned my daughters, these apps, which of course, anything on a phone I think is a mixed blessing. But I have written this memoir, I think, in a very particular spirit, which is the memoir combines my life in a pub in Dublin before I came to America, my story of immigration, romance, failed romance for many, many years, my failed romance, that would be failed romances, baseball, which was my way of fitting in when I came to this country, and Putin. So go figure, a book that combines romance, Putin, and baseball. No connection between romance and Putin, I assure you. But the reason I wouldn't have written this book if not for, this way, I think, if not for the 2016 election, but it was a wake-up call for me at how the constituency for caring about the kinds of things that you care about and I care about, how that constituency is frayed or maybe even shrinking. And so on the left and on the right, this kind of skepticism about an outward-focused America, about U.S. leadership in the world, even a skepticism about things that are empirically true, namely that leading in the world has been beneficial to the great majority of the American people. Those kind of first principles that many of us took for granted are all, I think, being contested, and now we have to show and not tell. And so I guess what I've done is try to tell a story. The other thing I do with my students is film. I think to be creative, but to take nothing for granted about, that there is a constituency for that outward orientation, for caring about the rest of the world, for seeing our fates as linked to those of other people. I think, especially those of you who are reaching young people at an early stage, what a gift you can give them if through rendering this material fun and accessible and lively, but also rendering these commitments seemingly beneficial to them by drawing on the facts as we know them, it'll change the world, and it'll change it in the directions we need to change it. So thank you.
Oh. Alas, our time is up. We've actually gone over time. A couple of notes. Samantha Power is going to step over here. She has, I know many of the teachers have books they'd like to have signed. There are books for sale. It is a fantastic read. You won't be able to put it down. We thank you so much for your insight. We could have had you stay all day, but can't do that. Let us all be upstanders and make the change happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.